everybody. Welcome today. We have Patrick Renouf with us, and he is a maths coach, a maths consultant. We're going to try and make coach-sultant or some version of that happen by the end of this session. But welcome, Patrick. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's really exciting to be doing this. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
We're really excited to have you here. We know, that you're very passionate about maths, and we're passionate too, and we're really excited to talk to you a little bit about your passion and your journey in maths. And my first question to you, or our first question, is very much like, what does inquiry in maths really mean? And what kind of misconceptions are out there in that regard?
Yeah, maths is a really interesting one. People have so many deeply held beliefs and values around the subject, and I have a lot of interesting conversations about inquiry. And I think when I was teaching back in Britain, like millennia ago, I knew the importance of inquiry, but I would like randomly grab something from Enrich and we would do that, and that would be our inquiry. It would be, let's plan a party. And yes, that is an inquiry of sorts. But through my journey, I've learned that it's actually so much more. Really, mathematical inquiry is the thread that runs through your units. And it's really about identifying patterns and connections between, I call them case studies. That's the term that Lynn Erickson and Lois Lanning uses, these case studies. And so that might be between the sums you're working on, between the word problems, between the shapes, between the graphs, whatever your case studies are, and looking for patterns and making generalizations. And just kind of really delving into that, because I think that's what mathematicians do. They look for ways to explain the world through patterns and connections in all this chaos that we have. And so it's really come to mean something else for me. I think as well, there's a real misconception that inquiry just means, like, I know when I first heard it, I was just like, it's just free range chickens. It's just like picking everywhere at everything. And you're just kind of like, I don't know what to do. And I think that comes from way, way back in the day when it was sort of all about discovery learning and open learning and all that sort of stuff. And that's all been a bit disproven now, debunked, because the cognitive load on children is too much. So inquiry is not about going out there and finding out what's out there, because children will never know what they don't know. It's about inductive learning versus deductive learning. So I'm going to try and keep this short, but deductive learning is basically what happened to me when I was at school. Deductive learning was the teacher stood at the front, presented a truth, a learning objective, then presented us with examples of that truth, that learning objective, and we kind of went, well, yeah, oh, look, what you said at the beginning was correct. So effectively, here's the end of the movie, now go watch it. Whereas inductive learning is sort of, inviting children in through questioning, presenting case studies and, examples, and then the children going, wait, I'm seeing this in all these things. So that must mean, oh, this is the truth. And they come up with the truth at the end. And secretly, you're rubbing your hands together going, yes, I knew it all along. You are the puppet master, and they feel they've discovered it for themselves, even though we know it's true in maths already. Let them think they've made it up. And that's kind of on a sliding scale. Like, you can go deductive when you need to be. Like, sometimes you need to tell the chickens which seeds to peck so they know when they're in the farmyard what's a seed and what's not. And sometimes, that's like battery chickens, I suppose. Then you can have them in the barn, then you can have them free. You're in charge of that sort of freedom. And that's around the agency part and the inductive learning. So I think in a nutshell, that's kind of my view of inquiry in maths. And I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer more of them about that.
It's interesting. Sorry, Hannah. I was going to say, it's interesting you use chickens. Because I had an experience with chickens in inquiry when I was looking at different schools for my daughter, and one of the schools I looked at, they were saying how they were an inquiry-based school. They weren't an IB school, but they let the students inquire, and they were saying that if they were studying, the example she used was if they were studying fractions that day, and a child brought in a chicken or like they'd scrap the lesson and they'd all inquire into chickens. And I was like, oh, no, like that's not it. Like if you're doing fractions and someone brings in a chicken, we're in a rural area. Why not make the fraction lesson about chickens, like eggs at market? Like there's so many different things you could do that the child's interest and their line of inquiry that they've brought in can be brought into the objective, rather than just being like, well, I guess that's what we're learning today.
Yeah, exactly. Although I am a bit worried about doing fractions of chickens. That sounds like sounds like there might be a barbecue involved. But you're absolutely right. Like you don't do it for the sake of doing it, but also the connection needs to be authentic. You know, you don't want to push something so the kids can be like, oh, wait, are we doing fractions? Are we doing chickens? And what is, you know, but that you can use those things. Absolutely. But yeah, do not scrap a lesson on fractions because of chickens.
I thought it was interesting what you said about like teachers at the front of the board. And I remember in my early days of teaching, being the teacher at the front of the board, because that was what was modeled to me through my teacher education. And just sometimes positioning yourself at the back of the room, leaning against the wall, and just that, even just that change of slight position opens up conversation a little bit more. And it's no longer me telling you, it's, oh, tell me what you think, and then we can discuss it. And just sometimes almost just positioning yourself in a different location can just a little bit open up that inquiry a bit more.
And I think that's such a nice segue into the next question, right? I think a lot of, like, when you think of inquiry, like I think some teachers have a hard time to let go, right? Because they feel like I'm going to lose control and I don't know what the kids are going to discover, and then maybe I'm not prepared to help them or support them. So Patrick, one of the questions we really wonder about is like, how do you actually plan a unit of inquiry in maths where you kind of balance that kind of exploration, the skill development, and then really the conceptual understanding?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I have a couple of, I speak in metaphors, and so I'm going to try and stick to one metaphor. Otherwise, I end up mixing my metaphors. But hopefully, come along. I used to have a brilliant director of teaching and learning called Stuart McAlpine. I think he's at Aberdeen International School now, and he used to refer to things as the learning terrain. And I don't know where he got it from, so I'm attributing Stuart, but I've taken that with me because that metaphor sticks with me the most. I think if you know, we've all done residential trips, I suppose many of us have done residential trips. And if you're taking kids out on a hike, we're not just going to let them go off exploring, you know, wherever we are, the mountains. Like in Switzerland, we'd be in the mountains. We're not going to the entire Alps here. We need to decide which part of the Alps we're going to. As teachers, we need to understand, you know, where the hiking trails are, what we're going to do. We need to assess for fitness as well. Like, are the kids fit enough for that hiking trail? Is it this hiking trail which is appropriate? We need to know where that cave's cool, that waterfall's cool, that viewpoint's cool. We can't miss these points out. However, there might be different ways to it depending on that. So through becoming an inquiry teacher, I learned so much more about my curriculum. Whereas before, I was teaching schemes that weren't about curriculum. They were just about covering stuff in maths. I can tell you, I have taught maths so badly. I feel like at some point, I need to go around to children who were in my class and somehow, maybe I'll open a therapy center for them. I don't know, because we once had a scheme which was entirely based on everybody using cups, like little paper cups, like, you know, those little ones you get for ketchup at a fast food. Everyone had that. They all had mats. They all sat in rows. We did 2 cups and they moved 2 cups, add 3 cups and moved 3 cups. That's fine. Everything, fractions were done through cups. Everything was done through cups. I kid not. We had a lot of money to make by coming to the island of Jersey and selling that because we all hopped on. So that taught me nothing about maths, apart from maybe now a good story on a podcast and how not to teach it. It came from, I think we just talked earlier, it came from as well, like as you plan your inquiry, thinking of yourself as a teacher. What's your image of yourself as a teacher? Reggio have this image of the child but we need to have an image of the teacher. What are we like as teachers? Are we controlling every part of it? Because that's not going to help the anxious mathematicians. How are we going to be? And I've got it, it's kind of going into, I think, another one of our questions, but being the guide on the side and not the sage on the stage. And go back to the learning terrain, you know, as you're leading the hike, you know, you've got the map, you know where it's going, but you're kind of allowing them to go, yeah, we'll go off on that if that's possible or whatever. But in there's kind of like, so I'm very concept-based inquiry, so I'm always moving up from that sort of 2-dimensional facts and skills up to that 3-dimensional transferable. It's kind of knowing intentionally how to do that. It is possible, however, that in your inquiry, children can state understandings and truths around mathematics without being fluent yet in the knowledge and skills. And that's okay. In fact, that's amazing, because then they have the context of why we're doing the skills and knowledge. They understand the importance. So it is okay to press pause on your inquiry while we work on some skills and knowledge that are necessary in order to access further understanding later or now. And it's about you as a teacher being in control of that and knowing, okay, this group maybe needs to spend a bit of time, slow them down. Those can move on. We know where we're going, and kind of understanding that. But it all comes from really understanding your curriculum, having really great ongoing assessments in place. Every learning engagement is an assessment. You don't have to wait to a summative or something. It's always ongoing. The children are constantly communicating to you what they're understanding. And so again, it's that idea of your image of yourself as a teacher. Am I one who goes, no, I will do a whole week, and on Friday I will see what has gone in. Stay till next Friday. I'm not like that. Learning doesn't happen in weeks. Learning happens when it happens. And I kind of let the children guide me in that, but I also know that I kind of like with the hiking groups, like, okay, folks, we need to move this hike on, otherwise we're not going to get there. Also the assessment points, like, okay, who needs to stop for a sandwich? That's my other part of that metaphor. So to balance things, I think that during your week, you should have number talks at least 3 times a week, but like well-structured ones. You need to have some element of spiral review where you're reviewing stuff you're not teaching at the moment. That needs to come in 2 or 3 times a week. Then you have your conceptual inquiry lesson, like this is our unit part. And then there needs to be an element every day of reflection and metacognition. I think if you do that, I mean, first of all, you'll spend your entire time teaching maths. So I understand, you know, why difficult. But if you are clever about it and sort of like, you know, allow the flow to kind of ebb and flow, that sort of you should be able to do it.
You know, Patrick, I saw, I think on one of your posts on LinkedIn, like a few days ago, that you were subbing in a classroom, and there was this worksheet about shapes, and you had a whole post about like how you're going to make that worksheet into inquiry. And I was wondering, Patrick, if you could explain to us what you actually did, because like, oh my goodness, that really shows nicely the process, because I could imagine some teachers are listening to this right now and be like, I just don't know how to do inquiry. Like, just give me first steps. And I thought like, that was such a nice post. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I can do this in my classroom.
Yeah, so just to put a bit of context in, I think this teacher was moving house and had literally gone to Twinkle and gone, here's some work for the supply teacher, which I have done. So I am not criticizing this teacher at all, because this dude needs to teach some maths. My classes needs, I've got it. But yeah. So I looked at it and was like, it was kind of like, color all the spheres red. And I was like, well, they're not really learning anything about 3-dimensional shape, because all the 3-dimensional shapes are actually 2-dimensional. So that's not great. But I very quickly, my first thing to do, if you want to take a step to being an inquiry teacher, just try flipping your lesson objective into a question. And already, you know, because our brains are hardwired to think about questions whether we like it or not, which is why people find small talk at parties quite exhausting, because no matter, it's like, hey, how are you? You've been asked a question, your brain goes, it's straight into thinking about it, whether it wants to or not, which is why we all just go, fine. Because that's it. You know, you haven't had your coffee yet. It's 7 o'clock in the morning or whatever. And how are you? You don't want the answer to that, so fine. So by flipping that learning intention into a question, you're already starting. So basically with this one, I thought, okay, because I looked at, my first thought was when I looked at all the 3D shapes, they're all 2D because they're all on a sheet. So I thought, okay, well, let's think, I want them to inquire into what's the connection between 2D shapes and 3D shapes. And then, believe it or not, I had to go and hunt for a set of 3D shapes. Every teacher I asked went, oh, yeah, I think there's one somewhere. And I was like, okay, so I did find some, blew the dust off them, got the kids. And we looked at the shapes and we just started. So first of all, because I've got an inquiry brain, I knew I wanted to get them to the point where they understood that 3D shapes were made from 2D shapes. But to get back, I kind of wanted them to look at the 3D shapes. So we just did it. There was only like, it's a very small class. I had like 10. It's a small school. And so we looked together and we kind of just looked at the shapes and said, how would we group these shapes? What groups would we put them into? So I think for the first time in a long time, first of all, they were holding 3D shapes. They were exploring them. We started to group them, obviously prisms, pyramids and other ones. And then we gave them names. And then we just talked a little bit about 2D, 1D, 3D. 1D is really important. People often forget that. And then I just sort of said, I mean, I was literally kind of doing this on the hoof. And I was like, let's get the paper out, put a shape on and just trace around the end of the shape. And then when they removed it, they were like, oh my gosh. It leaves a 2D shape. And I was like, yeah. And then I was like, just keep going, just keep going. And eventually one of them went, wait, if I can do this in the right order, can I cut them out and stick it together to make the shape? And I was like,
That's super cool.
That's awesome.
Yes, you can. And then they were like, they were all doing it. And in fact, I kind of felt guilty because I was like, well, those sheets aren't being done, but hopefully the teacher will understand. And then at the end, we co-constructed a class generalization together. I asked them again, I said, what do you think the connection between 2D and 3D shapes are? And one of them was like, she was like, well, the pyramids here have got squares and triangles on them. And I was like, great. Can we make it more general so it applies to more shapes? And then one of the kids just went, well, all 3D shapes have got 2D shapes on them. So all 3D shapes are made of 2D shapes. And the kids were like, yeah. And I said, is that new understanding for you? And they were like, yeah, it is. And I was like, great, because we've gone from that 2-dimensional thinking to the 3-dimensional thinking, literally, and figuratively as well. So that was sorry, I'm trying to keep this short. That was
this is so
I think also those things are so much more memorable. Like I remember building things in class, and like my favorite teacher was where we did stuff, and it wasn't worksheets. It was, we applied it, and it not just in maths, but those are kind of the things that stay with you, the meaningful things.
And I love how you said, Patrick, like this idea of like, you ask them questions, they start exploring, and then those aha moments, like this little light bulb. It's like, now it all makes sense. And that's what we want in our students. And I love when when you talked before, like inquiry is not just like you do whatever you want, like the laissez-faire, but actually you go in as a teacher and you really planned it carefully so the kids can have this like aha moment, right? And I thought that was such a nice example.
Yeah, and it builds into that, Jay Ty, is it McTy and I can never remember their duo name, Wiggins, and they're kind of backwards by design. Sorry, when there's so many people in your head who tell you research, and that kind of, I knew where I wanted them to be. So I kind of, and that was, how do I work back from there? And what questions can I ask to sort of lead up to that? Because, and I saw this on somebody's post the other day on LinkedIn, and I thought, I haven't heard that in years. Telling is not teaching. And I think in maths too often we rely on telling, this is just how it is. And I think if we keep telling kids, in my mind, here's another metaphor. Maths for me as a child was like the blocks in Tetris, the game you got with the Game Boy. And it was just, here's another block, here's another block, here's another block. Oh, and by the way, the music's getting faster and I don't know how to spin these blocks around and store them. And I can't make the lines disappear. It's just this higgledy-piggledy mess. Whereas if we give children time to allow them to put them, they can make those lines disappear and create room for new ideas coming in. But if we just keep telling them and sending them another block and sending them another block, some kids can do it. Great. Others need time to spin those blocks around and to put them away. If you've never played Tetris before, first of all, you're very young listening to it. You can all go Google it and try and play it. And listen to music.
It's like talking about Snake on phones. A lot of people do that.
You know, Patrick, I think this is so interesting because this idea of like you hear all this, and then you know, if you're not in an inquiry-based classroom, maybe you may wonder, like, you know, how's my role from being a traditional math teacher different from like being an inquiry math teacher? I wonder if you could talk about like, what would a teacher in an inquiry classroom do if the kids are all exploring? Like, what do you do as a teacher?
Well, that's your time to write your reports, clearly. They're busy. No, it's not. It's so we talked about the guide on the side, but I have another bit as well. And again, comes from the sort of Reggio school of thinking, is that your teacher is a researcher. And sometimes I think I like to think of myself as Jane Goodall observing the chimps. I'm not saying that the children are chimps, but I like to take on that role. And I think who better to think of than Jane Goodall? She's like, what would Jane do? And it's just observing. So sometimes, and it's planning it so that sometimes you'll have everyone working together on something. And that's really important because you never become a better tennis player without playing somebody better than you. So if we constantly have children playing children the same level as themselves, they never get exposed to better thinking. Also, those better mathematicians, I'm saying better, you know what I mean? Never get a chance to sort of help other people, which is what makes a great mathematician. Being a great mathematician does not involve taking all your learning and then going sitting up on top of a hill somewhere and being mystical and never letting anybody else near it. It's about sharing that. So it's kind of my role as a teacher is to create different times where different people work together, but then also times where I might be like, okay, this little group needs a little time with me while the others are doing fluency work or review work or something. And so, yeah, and taking on that role as teacher, as a researcher. So I'm always listening in, and sometimes I'll be working with a group, but actually got my ear on the group behind me, you know, a bit like the PFG. I mean, they're big enough, and just sort of like being available. And then sometimes that's where the magic happens. You hear a conversation, and sometimes I push my chair a little bit back and just sort of lean back, and I'm like, it's happening, and keeping those notes. So that's what I mean. Every learning engagement is an assessment opportunity. The other thing, my favorite thing in the world is James Nottingham's Learning Pit. It's the best visualization of learning ever. That learning doesn't go from point A to point B. It actually goes into a pit. And in fact, I think in his book range, it's David Epstein talks about effective learning looks like falling backwards. And it's true, like things I've learned really, really well, I sucked at for the longest time, and sometimes even got worse. And was like, how is this getting worse? How? And then all of a sudden, you know, you come out the other side higher up. And it's the idea that I say to the kids, and I got this from Joe Bowler's books as well, like, you know, I say to them, like, we're in the learning pit and it's a pace to be celebrated. It's confusing, it's tricky, it's difficult, but it's good. It's an appropriate level of grapple. It's not struggle, but it's grapple. Struggle is sort of like, I think grapple is sort of treading water and being able to sort of figure out how to move forward. Struggle is you going under. You don't want that. And the idea is that we want children to get out of the learning pit themselves. We're not there to rescue them. I would tell children sometimes, if I knew it was going to be a pretty sticky lesson, I'd be like, today I am throwing you all into the pit and I'm going to be deliberately unhelpful today. Because what, folks, that's life. Nobody ever taught me how to fill in my tax return. I had to figure it out. Nobody ever taught me all the stuff you need to know in life. So children need to get used to the fact that they're not always going to be helped out, and that they need to find their own ways to do that. So that kind of all the role of the teacher is not being their savior, not being like, oh, they got everything right on their test. I hate that. I hate it. I hate it when the pre-assessment comes back and it's all right, because now I'm like, oh, now I have to do something else for you to do. if they only ever tell you, if they get everything right, I always, and I got this from Joe Bowler's book as well, I always say to them, I'm sorry you didn't learn anything today, because you only showed me what you already knew. And that's on me as a teacher. I should have provided something else that was more of a challenge. But now I know. So let's just say that was, review or something.
So Patrick, that's so interesting though, right? Because I think you have to develop that kind of culture where kids feel like I should make a mistake because that's when I learn, right? Like I remember a teacher, she actually made a chant up with the students, like every time somebody made a mistake, they had a whole chant going on and it was all about their brain growing. And I was like, oh, that's so sweet. So the kids actually, they wanted to try and they're like, oh, I just can't figure it out. And they knew their brain was growing. But I think it's a culture that you develop in the classroom, because I think in school traditionally, right, you get an A, that's all we want from you, but not this idea of like make mistakes and struggle and grapple a little bit with that idea.
I think too, like explicitly teaching the learning pit to the kids, they realize that everyone's in the learning pit with them. They're not there alone, and everyone's going through it, and everyone's feeling like that.
Yeah. I feel like it'd be helpful for parents to know that as well, because you've got those parents who are, I want the A. I don't actually care about you being in the pit. I want, and like teaching, you talked about like the culture in the classroom, trying to have that culture with parents as well, and trying to get them to understand that grappling is good, and actually the A doesn't really mean as much as being in the pit and how you got out of it.
Exactly. And like when I assess my, I'm sorry, Kelly, when I assess my children for the pre-assessments that I do, I don't mark it right or wrong. So first of all, I get them to go through it, and they put green if it's something that looks familiar to them, yellow, they just highlight it if it's something they think they're not sure, and red if it's like, okay, this is new, or pink because it's highlighter, this is brand new. And then they start with the green questions, they go to the yellow questions, and they go to the red questions at the end, which first of all is a really good skill for life. You don't have to go through everything in order. Second of all, I as a teacher have a lot of information about the mindset of that child going into this. I also get them to write me notes on all over their assessments. But when I assess it, if there's just a number and it's correct, I have my own traffic light system. Green is they understand it, there was a correct answer, and there was working to support it, there was evidence. Yellow, correct answer, no evidence, or evidence but no correct answer. And red is absolutely completely off the mark or empty, right? And it's quite nice to do that, because they know I don't just accept an answer because it could be a fluke. But I also get them to write me little notes, and they're brilliant, and they make marking things so much more fun. Once I had this child who did a long division, and it was perfect. Well, I don't know why we were doing long division, because the algorithm is another podcast entirely, because I hate. And anyway, the child had done, as part of it, done this long division, and it was perfect. And underneath, they had written, "This took me ages," with about 5 A's.
Oh.
I thought, thank you, because I know you're not fluent with that and you are desperately digging. So that's another thing about the assessment, is it's not just focusing on what they got right or wrong, it's focusing on how they've gone about it and the understanding. I think that's really, that helps to shift the focus.
So interesting, Patrick. I know we could talk to you for hours because there's so much to talk about. I know, like, walking away from it, I loved how you said, like, you as a teacher, you're like a researcher, and you observe and you listen and you lean back and you work with the others. And I feel like one thing I'm really hearing you saying is like understanding who your students are, but then also be brave enough of like just trying something out. And I know, like, when Caitlin, Hannah, and we talk to other people, we often talk like about, you don't all have to go from 0 to 100. Just try one little thing. And I wonder, Patrick, I know you work with a lot of schools, a lot of educators and teachers around the world. And I wonder if a teacher would come to you and be like, Patrick, I just never did it. What's the one thing I should get started with? I wonder, what would you tell the teacher? Like, do you have like a quick, like, here, a few little tips or tricks how you can get started?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's a journey, right? I didn't sort of wake up one day and be able to do this. Like, I've been through my own learning pit, many of them. I'd say to people, you can't do this alone. It's a lot. Like, you need to have thinking buddies, and whether that's somebody who's in your school or somebody you can connect with via, you know, via Zoom or whatever, that's brilliant. But really try sort of thinking about, what do you want the children to understand, and how are you going to get there? What questions might you ask to get there? And that's a big one. And the other thing I would recommend then is, if I can do a plug for a book or two, would be get Rachel French and Carla Marshall's Concept-Based Inquiry in Action. And that is, Lynn Erickson and Lois Lanning did all the concept-based inquiry stuff. Theirs is very theoretical, and it's Rachel and Carla are teachers, have been teachers, and they know how to make what I call the haute couture into high street. So if you want a few years, like, it's like that scene in Devil Wears Prada, like, you know, oh, what's that? That's just blue, and it's like, actually, it's brilliant. It's that idea that you can, they have got all these strategies. So concept-based inquiry in action is a really good way to get just a bit of a taster, to start thinking about how you can make things inductively. Or just follow me.
Well, let's go there. How can we follow you, Patrick? Put it out.
Oh my gosh, how can you follow me? Oh my gosh. Well, you know, I live in Zurich, so no. I am on LinkedIn. You just look for Patrick Renouf, and that's where I put a whole load of stuff. I've also got my website, which is patrickrenouffcoaching.com. I think I haven't typed it in for a while. So, or you can email me, patrickrenouffcoaching@gmail.com, and just get in touch.
It's so nice to spend Tuesday afternoon with us and speaking to you, and I'm sure, like, you inspire a lot. Like, I know I'm walking away with some really nice ideas. So thank you so much for your time today, Patrick.
Oh, and thank you for having me. It's been wonderful to share all this, and I just love talking about it. So you're very lucky I kept it this short.